The TaxPert Topslicer checker will help you see at a glance whether the HMRC calculations, or indeed your own tax return software calculations for top slicing relief on chargeable event gains, are correct or seriously incorrect. The Topslicer checker arose because of concerns that the revenue calculator was incorrectly applying the legislation, and this has now been confirmed by the first tier tribunal in the Marina Silver case and reacted to by HMRC by their withdrawing their appeal against that decision and also changing the legislation in the March 2020 budget. The latest version of our Topslicer checker incorporates the changes in the March 2020 budget, and you'll be able to see how the calculations work for chargeable event gains both before and after the 11th of March 2020. Now let's have a look at how the checker can assist you. We start as usual with our apps by inputting the basic data, the yellow background fields are the input cells. And before we do that, though, we can select whether the taxpayer is a Scottish taxpayer or in the rest of the UK. And we can also select the tax year. And let me start with a 1920 tax year, although at the moment we can go all the way back to 1314, and that'll be useful if you're now wanting to make repayment claims on behalf of clients affected by the Silver judgment. Well, if I select 1920, then that'll be the calculations before the March 20 budget. If I input, let's say, 50,000 of employment income, it could be rental, it could be other income. I want to keep it quite simple. You've got the different types of income that'll affect the allocation of allowances and reliefs. And then there's space to input the chargeable event gains. They need to be put in on the tables on the right, either UK chargeable event gains, where we need the amount of the gain, let's say 100,000, and the term, which is going to be used for the calculation of top slicing relief. Let's say it's been held for 20 years. And you can see that the 100,000 then populates the left-hand screen to give us total income that year of 150. And I've given you space for up to 8 different chargeable event gains. And also, if it's a non-UK gain, where the calculations are slightly different, we've got space for 8 of those as well. But let's stick with the UK gains. Now, the key result is immediately shown here, and I can see that for 1920, the revenue calculator would calculate top slicing relief of only 3,800, whereas the correct calculation is £16,000 higher at £19,800. And so using the revenue calculator or your own tax return software, you will be overcharging the client by £16,000. And although the revenue have changed the legislation for 2021, the decision in the Silver case means that you should now make claims for clients to have the top slicing relief recalculated in the way that this calculator does. On the revenue calculations, by the way, notice what I've got here. I've got the current revenue calculation figure of 3,800, and that is using the methodology that the revenue introduced in autumn of 2018. Before that, they would only have given 0 top slicing relief in this case. And so if you were going back, let's say to 1617, then the original calculation might have been 0, but the current revenue calculator, which has not been updated for Silver, would only give 3,800. So it all gets quite complicated, but that's all set out clearly. Now let's go back to the main screen. What you will also need in submitting claims is workings. And what I've done is include a second tab. There are only 2 tabs in this worksheet, and you can't see those figures on screen, but these clearly set out the calculation in accordance with the legislation, Section 535 of the Income Tax Trade and Other Income Act. And you can see that there are 3 sets of calculations that go into it. The calculation ignoring top slicing relief, where in this example you would not get any personal allowance because of the level of income including the gain. And then we have to calculate that taking the chargeable event gains as the highest part of income. In this simple example, it makes no difference. And then we have to calculate the tax assuming we only bring in 1 slice of 5,000. And the difference here, and in the silver case, and since the change in the legislation from 11th of March 20, is in the personal allowance. I've got 12,500 here, whereas here I've got none because of the level of income unless we take the slice. And it's that generates the additional top slicing relief that we had, well, we have it up at the top here. We can see that top slicing relief figure of 19,800. The difference of 16,000 there is the reintroduction of that personal allowance when we do the calculation on the slice. Now, if we have a look at the slice calculation, I just want to show you the impact of the second change in the Finance Act 2020, as it will be. The first change is that the revenue accept that from 11th of March 20, we do reinstate that personal allowance to 12,500. The silver case means that they must accept that for previous years as well, and that's where agents will have a lot of work to do with clients who've overpaid. And the change is in the allocation of these allowances, the second change, that is. The first change is they accept now the 12.5. For 1920, my calculator allocates the allowances in the most advantageous way, but the second change in the Finance Act will require the allowances to be allocated to income other than the chargeable event slice of 5,000. And so instead of the 8 and the 4.5, we will have the whole of the 12.5 allocated to the 50. Now let's have a look at the effect of that. And if I go back to my initial screen, at the moment, we're looking at the calculation for 1920. You can see I've got top slicing relief of 19,800. But if I change that to 2021, well, we know, of course, that the allowances and rate bands are the same for 2021, unless you're in Scotland. But what has changed? Two things. The revenue will now accept that the allowance of 12,500 is used in the slice calculation. But, and this is the bad news, the way in which the allowances are allocated is now restricted for 2020. So when I click 2020-21, my top slicing relief plummets down to 3,800. Now, it will depend on what the combinations of figures are. And if I look at my workings, you can see the reason for that is, as I was saying, all of the 12.5 is now allocated against the 50. Whereas if I go back to the 1920 calculation and then look at the workings, we're allocating 8 and 4.5. And it's that's the second change in this year's finance bill. Horribly complicated, I know, but this app makes it all very, very simple and gives you the full workings. But that change sometimes will be good news, sometimes not. If I delete the 50,000, then I can see for 1920, this would be a taxpayer who's got 100,000 of chargeable event gain and nothing else. Well, I don't know until I look at the figures what's going to happen, but for 1920, both I and the revenue agree that it would be 8,900. For 2021, well, that's interesting. The change in the legislation, in fact, increases the top slicing by 2,500. So my figure goes up to 11,400. The revenue will catch up with that. That 8,900 is the revenue's current calculator. They haven't yet updated it in the way that I have for the finance bill changes. Well, let me now show you another change that has been put through the finance bill, and that's where we're looking at other reliefs, for example, qualifying loan interest, loss relief, etc. Let's imagine that for this fairly simple example, I've got other reliefs of £100,000, and those are restricted, which means that the amount of relief will be limited to the greater of 50,000 or a quarter of the adjusted income. Now, when I put those figures through for 1920, you'll see that the revenue and I both agree on the tax as 0 because we've got top slicing relief of 8,900. Whereas if I change the 1920 to 2021, what the revenue legislation does is allow us to reinstate the personal allowance, but it doesn't require us to restrict the losses by reference to the slice. and that actually increases the amount of top slicing relief by 11,400. In this particular case, it makes no difference to the bottom line because of the notional tax credit. But if I were to show you how this would work if it was a non-UK chargeable gain, let me delete the UK chargeable gain and instead put it as a non-UK gain, where we don't in fact then have any notional tax credit. You can see again that for 2021, we've got 11,400 of top slicing relief. The current revenue calculator would only give us 8.9, whereas if I go back to the 1920 calculation, then again, the revenue figure is 8.9, as is mine. Well, as you've seen, it's a really complicated area, and what I've tried to do is make sure that our app helps you to see the results in a quick and easy way, but also provides you with the workings that you could then print out and submit to HMRC, together with a claim that your client's tax has been overcalculated and you want it calculated in the correct way. More details, of course, on our website.